Hello, guys. Welcome to another episode of our franchise discussion. I am joined today by Alexander Kozina.
Hello, hello, hello.
And today we're going to talk about something that is very near and dear to Alex's heart, which is Metal Gear. Metal Gear Solid.
Gear. Well, that's not when Snake. So the whole Metal Gear is kind of a meme in the Metal Gear Solid series. But if you go back and play the first Metal Gear Solid game where Snake says it, he doesn't say it nearly as gruffly. It's more like, "Huh, Metal Gear." But Snake's voice has become so iconic, his graveliness so iconic that people have taken it and just exaggerated over and over the years.
I remember this great cutscene in the first Metal Gear Solid where Snake has to sneak into this base and there's this helicopter standing there. ID! That's fantastic. So anywho, Metal Gear. Yeah, some of you may or may not know that Alex, when he first started working on his channel, made a video, and his first video was actually about the Metal Gear Solid and the cancelled games. Would you like to briefly talk about that?
Yeah. So, when you first contacted me, you were like, hey, what's a series that you're close to that you could maybe write about for the channel? Because, right off the bat, you didn't want to be like, hey, work on a series like Empire Earth, work on a series that you've never heard before. You wanted me to, you wanted to wean me in and start me off doing something that I wasn't something that I was pretty familiar with, so it would be more natural and comfortable for me. And it's like, well, I actually really got into the Metal Gear Solid series as of recent. And you're like, okay, sure, let's do that. And I know that people have called for us to kind of do a bigger retrospective series on the entirety of the Metal Gear saga at some point. I'm sure that's coming in the future. But right there at that moment in time, I don't know who it was who recommended it, but I believe you were like, hey, why not do a video on all of the canceled Metal Gear Solid games? And I was like, yeah, sure. And partially what made this easy is, as it would happen, at the time I was still in university. And one of the classes that I was taking at the time, I had to write about like a piece of art or media and like basically dissect it and analyze it. And I chose to write about Metal Gear Solid 2. And so for the purpose of that project, I ended up like actually doing a fair bit of research into Metal Gear Solid 2's development. And so I already knew in advance a fair bit of the things that I brought up in the middle of that video, where I talked about what Metal Gear Solid 2 was basically originally going to be. The other, and in addition to that, I also knew a fair bit about the whole like Metal Gear Rising / Metal Gear Solid Rising Revengeance stuff as well. I did not know about the first thing that the video discusses, though, which is the Metal Gear Solid game for the Tiger Gamecom. Was that it?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that was entirely new to me, but I'm glad that I discovered it, because it certainly is an interesting part of video game history that I feel like a lot of people do not know about, and I'm glad that we kind of got to surface it and expose a lot of people to it.
Yeah, it definitely is a curiosity, even though there's never been any footage of it. But talking about Metal Gear and how the franchise has kind of stuck with you, how were you first introduced to the franchise as a whole, and what was kind of the first game in the series that you were exposed to or played?
So, like, you would probably be surprised to hear this, but I honestly did not play the Metal Gear Solid series until pretty recently. Metal Gear is one of those games that was always kind of like growing up, I was always exposed to it. I was always made aware of it. You might remember that in 2008, a little game called Super Smash Bros. Brawl got released. And in that game, Solid Snake was a guest character, which was really significant because up until that point, Super Smash Bros. Was an entirely Nintendo first-party series. There were no third-party characters in it. And so, but that game brought both Sonic the Hedgehog and Snake into it. And that's kind of the thing, is that growing up, I was this Nintendo gamer, and yet, like, I often felt in this weird sort of way, even though it is gritty and mature and very tonally different from a lot of Nintendo games, that the Metal Gear Solid series always kind of had this Nintendo, from my kind of like limited understanding of it, it seemed to have like this sort of Nintendo like quality to it, and it always seemed to get brought up in the same discussion as a lot of like classic Nintendo games. And so it was always part of my like upbringing as a video game player, I guess you could say. But it was not until like the mid 2010s actually where I really got into the series. I don't remember what year it was, but at some point I got my hands on a copy of the Legacy Collection. I believe that was the name. It was like the collection of all the Hideo Kojima produced Metal Gear Solid games that were that was released on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. And I pretty much just played the series in order from there. I started with Metal Gear Solid 1, then went to 2, then went to 3, then went to 4, then played Peace Walker because that was also included in the collection, then Revengeance, and then I played Metal Gear Solid 5 about a year later.
I see. So, and out of all these games that you've played, what would you consider to be your favorite, and why?
Oh, that's a tough question. Because all of them, like, when we eventually do the big, Metal Gear Solid Rise and Fall video, at some point in the future, like, the one thing that I think the Metal Gear Solid series is exceptionally good at is making it so that every single game in the series represents a substantial evolution forward from the previous game and feels substantially different, but it never feels like it completely jumps the shark and goes too far, gets too far away from what made the series special. There are, so many games that we've covered for the Main Gamers channel where the game starts doing one thing, its sequels improve on that, and then it kind of gets away from what made it special, and then the kind of series experiences a bit of a fall. What Metal Gear Solid, like, somehow the series did a perfect job of balancing the need to constantly iterate and be different, and the need to kind of be the same as well, and continue making what made people love it in the first place. That being said, I am very fond of Metal Gear Solid 2. I mean, I wrote that paper when I was in university about it, so obviously I had a certain fondness of it to want to write about it. I think that some of the like late game narrative stuff that happens in that game, without getting into any spoilers, is really profound, and like it's one of those games where there have been games that have broached similar themes and narrative content as Metal Gear Solid 2, but there has not been another Metal Gear Solid 2, really. It really is kind of a one-of-a-kind kind of game. That being said, its gameplay is a little bit dated, admittedly, and I would say that Metal Gear Rising, Revengeance, and Metal Gear Solid 5 are tied in terms of my favorite gameplay in the series. I wouldn't say one is better than the other because they're both pretty different games. Metal Gear Rising is a like Platinum game style action game, whereas Metal Gear Solid 5 is more traditional Metal Gear. But yeah, I'd say it's like basically a three-way tie between 2, 5, and Rising.
Okay, for sure. Seeing as, well, Metal Gear has been an eclectic franchise with a lot of different entries and a lot of different kind of approaches towards its formula. How would you describe the appeal of the franchise to someone who hasn't played any game of it yet? And would you say it's approachable to anyone who's into shooters or stealth titles?
Let me put it this way. Do you love crazy, insane stories with an incredible amount of exposition, but also an incredible amount of thought put into them? Do you love stealth gameplay? Do you love like a excessive amount of mechanics that are pretty overwhelming, but simultaneously a lot of fun to mess around with? Then you will love Metal Gear Solid. They are... earlier I just said a couple of sentences ago, like a lot of thought goes into these games. Like there is not a single corner in any of the Metal Gear Solid games where it doesn't feel like Kojima combed through them 3, 4, 5 times and was like, no, I need to make sure that this makes perfect sense in my own Hideo Kojima kind of, unique way. These games really feel painstakingly, like lovingly crafted down to the finest, smallest, most minute iota of information, of detail that you can find in them. And it really, when the games occasionally feel a little bit clunky, when like you're running through the first or the second Metal Gear Solid games and you're like, the stealth here is, not that great. The kind of richness of that, the richness of the thought that went into the environments, into the story, into the mechanics, makes up for that kind of clunkiness and kind of motivates you to kind of keep going forward.
Okay, I see. You briefly talked about this in your previous response regarding Metal Gear 2 and some of the subjects that it deals with. Metal Gear has always dealt with some fairly heavy material relating to real-world politics and issues. So what stands out to you as some of the most memorable questions or topics raised by a Metal Gear Solid game in this regard?
I mean, it's interesting to go back to the first Metal Gear Solid game, because that game has a extremely anti kind of nuclear war kind of Cold War message to it. There's this one part of the game where Snake is talking to, I think it might be the DARPA chief, and the DARPA chief is talking about how there are all these military bases around the world where nuclear weapons are still stockpiled, waiting in storage, and then the game ends, if I recall correctly, with some sort of message about how there are still X number of nuclear weapons around the world today. Damn. So there's clearly in the first Metal Gear Solid game, especially, a very heavy kind of nuclear weapon, anti-nuclear theme going on there. As the series progresses, though, it becomes less about, I guess you could say, physical weapons and more about computative weapons or cultural weapons, which is a lot of what Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3 are about, where there are Metal Gears that they have to fight. There are countdown timers to explosions that need to be stopped, but it really is more about the kind of the villains of those games trying to wrest control over the way that people fundamentally think about things and kind of change society covertly in that fashion. There's this is really nerdy, and it might be a little bit confusing, so I'm going to do my best to explain it. In Metal Gear Solid 2, they introduced this villainous group called the Patriots, but when a character without special clearance tries to say the Patriots, instead of saying the Patriots, they say the Lali Lulelo. So Raiden will be like, oh wait, what? The Lali Lulelo? And at first you're like, okay, that's a weird bit of Kojima exposition. But it actually, here's kind of the logic behind it. In the Japanese language, there are only certain different kinds of consonant sounds in existence. There are K sounds like ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. There are M sounds, ma, mi, mu, me, mo. There are R sounds, ra, ri, ru, re, ro. But there are no L sounds. Generally, when English words with L sounds are kind of borrowed by Japanese people, they replace L sounds with R sounds. And basically, the reason why Raiden says the Lali Lule Lo when talking about the Patriots is because the Patriots are this, as I was saying earlier, this sort of covert society that basically wants to manipulate the way that people think from the shadows. And they basically exist in this state where nobody knows that they exist. They literally exist in between the kind of mimetic cultural strata on which the world is built, in the same way that in Japanese, it's incredibly difficult for somebody who grows up speaking Japanese. It's hard for them to conceive of the idea of an L sound because all they know growing up are just R sounds or M sounds.
I see.
I'm sorry if that was a little bit rambling and confusing, but just to kind of illustrate the kind of crazy, simultaneously nonsensical yet incredibly well thought out thematic content that Kojima has in his games.
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of Kojima, you mentioned his name several times by now. It's kind of safe to say that he is really inexorably linked with the franchise. But considering there are many portable outings and even offshoots that aren't directed by him, would you say that his vision and guidance are inseparable from the franchise as a whole?
I wouldn't say that it's... I'd say that Kojima is very important to the Metal Gear Solid series. I think that it's challenging to pull off a Metal Gear Solid game without his great involvement. I've not played them, but I've heard from many people that the Metal Gear Acid games on the PSP are actually pretty decent. And Metal Gear Rising Revengeance was also very, very good. And in fact, there are actually some places of the game where I felt like Kojima's kind of non-involvement actually benefited that game. Specifically, I felt like there were aspects of that game's story that I felt were a lot more kind of clear and concise than I feel like they would have been otherwise if Kojima had been in charge of them. Yeah. So like, right now, a lot of fans are looking towards the future of the Metal Gear Solid series. They're wondering what Konami is going to do next with the series beyond, make pachinko machines. I think that, it remains to be seen exactly what happens next, considering that we got Metal Gear Survive not too long ago, and that was made without, Kojima's involvement at all. Mm-hmm. I think that if they want to do it right, and I think they know this, they really need to find somebody, and they need to kind of court them to be the next Kojima. They need a big name at the front of the game, directing and being in charge of a considerable amount of its creative vision in the way that Kojima is. And I feel like if not, the series' magic will probably be lost if they try to continue it in another fashion.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of understandable. Do you agree with some of the criticism about Kojima that, regarding his questionable design choices? You've previously mentioned this a bit with Metal Gear Rising. Many people say that, Kojima would be more qualified to direct movies rather than games. And they kind of bring up Metal Gear Solid 4's infamous 71-minute long cutscene as an example of that.
I mean, it's funny that you bring that up, because just a few days before we recorded this, Kojima mentioned how his new production studio, Kojima Productions, non-affiliated with Konami, is actually going to be making movies. And he said some sort of quote to the effect of, if a person is good at one thing, like making games, they're good at anything. And in the time since then, people have dissected that and gone back and forth and been well, is this actually what he said? Is that a literal translation of what he said in Japanese? Personally, I completely disagree with that. I'm not going to sit here on a pedestal and say the Metal Gear Solid games are absolutely immaculate, that every part of Kojima's vision and direction in those games is without fault. But I think that he is right at home making games and not movies. I think that so much of, some of the absolute best parts of the series, some of the most, I think, monumental moments directly stem from the gameplay. And I think that the cutscenes, while occasionally, yes, a little bit overly long, only complement and accentuate those gameplay moments.
I see. Okay, that kind of makes sense. When all is said and done with the Metal Gear Solid franchise, and the Metal Gear legacy as a whole, what do you see as one big main takeaway from its legacy? What kind of impact did Metal Gear have on the industry as a whole?
I mean, when I went and played the original Metal Gear Solid for the first time a little while ago, the one thing that kind of stood out to me is just how much DNA of the original Metal Gear Solid can be found in so many of the action games that follow it. Obviously, people know the Metal Gear Solid series as a series of stealth games, and they are that. They have wonderful stealth mechanics and gameplay, but they are also very much action games. And in the original Metal Gear Solid, what's so impressive about that game is how, one moment you'll be trying to shoot down this Hind-D helicopter out of the air with rockets. The next moment you'll be trying to get through this area that has an electrified floor. Then the next moment you'll be trying to control this remote guided missile around some corridors to open a door. Playing through that game, the DNA of this game can be found in Uncharted. It can be found in Platinum action games. There are so many just third person games in general, not just stealth games, that leaned so heavily and learned so much from that game's design. And I would definitely say that, while there is no other video game developer or creative individual that makes games in the world that quite makes video game stories like Kojima, I'd like to imagine that the level of thought and detail that Kojima puts into his stories definitely had an influence on other developers around him, both in Japan and abroad. But again, I don't think that... I think that, like I said, people mainly borrow the gameplay stuff that the Metal Gear Solid series does. They tend to respect, but not necessarily borrow as much from the story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these, like, really, as you would call it, Hideo Kojima moments that are so unique to his vision, and kind of like, there are these jokes that only really work when he does it. Would you be able to name any other, like, franchise or game that tried to emulate that same look and feel, or is that just impossible? Is that something that really only Hideo Kojima did and only he can pull off?
It's tough because, unfortunately, the first game that came to mind is Metal Gear Solid Rising, but that almost doesn't really count because that was like Kojima still like partially oversaw that game and whatnot. It is. Yeah, they are kind of unique in that sense.
His little quirks will always remain his own, I believe. I have tried to look for other titles that really try to approach that same level of zaniness, but there's not really anything quite like Metal Gear in that regard.
No, not really.
No. So, looking back to the franchise as a whole, and save for the critically maligned Metal Gear Survive, are you happy with the way that Konami and Kojima kind of left the franchise behind?
See, this is a tough question to answer because, like, I'm not super pleased with the way that Metal Gear Solid 5 ended narratively. I think that gameplay-wise, it's really great, and I still think that it's, like, in spite of that, a very, very good game. Metal Gear Solid 5's story, though, definitely was not nearly as good as it could have been. Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, it's pretty clear that Kojima, for a very long period of time, had been wanting to kick off and leave the Metal Gear Solid saga. He definitely did not want to kind of keep going with it. And I mean, that's kind of why Metal Gear Solid 4 was so infamous for its incredibly long cutscenes, because he's like, I'm going to try to really make sure that I wrap up everything in this. And the fact of the matter is that while there was a fair bit of content that was cut from Metal Gear Solid 5 for what people believe are due to Konami coming in and meddling and basically restricting how much more work he could do with it, that game's design was definitely designed by a Kojima that wanted to kind of hand the series into the community's hands and like leave them kind of feeling like, okay, this is ours to kind of like own now. Snake in that game, talks way more seldomly than any of the other Snakes in any of the other prior Metal Gear Solid games. And while there is a narrative reason that is very spoilery that I won't get into, I think that it is also Kojima being like, this Snake is your Snake to control. It's your persona. It's your character. It's the person, whoever you want to define. I'm kind of relinquishing my voice, my control over the saga. At least that's how I kind of interpret some of the decisions that he made in Metal Gear Solid 5. I see.
So yeah, after Metal Gear Solid 5, he went on to direct the Ailert.
Sorry, if I could just quickly before I could, I just also want to add to, like, there isn't really like a lot of like narrative stuff that there is left to kind of explore in the series. There are things like, for example, people have brought up like, Snake's mentor, the boss. Maybe we could do like a cool World War II action espionage game in the future. Like that, there are definitely holes in the Metal Gear Solid saga's history that have definitely not been very well explored, but there really are no big, gigantic things like lingering questions that have yet to be answered. And so that definitely took some of the edge off of the disappointment of the way that Metal Gear Solid 5 ended and the way that Kojima and Konami broke up.
I see. Well, unfortunately, there was even more disappointment in store for Kojima, which is after Metal Gear Solid 5, he went on to work on the ill-fated Silent Hills game. Before that, he managed to release a demo called PT. Do you feel like Kojima having more creative freedom in his endeavors, both with the ill-fated Silent Hills and now Death Stranding, do you feel like overall that's a good thing, that he's left to his own devices and not really have any other the strain of the Metal Gear franchise on him anymore?
I mean, it's funny you say that, because like playing the Metal Gear Solid games, I never felt like he let the kind of constraints of what that series was really prevent him from being as crazy as he could be. Like in Metal Gear Solid 5, it's like this game takes place in the 1980s, and yet there are like all sorts of strange futuristic technologies and nanomachines and people that are able to pull swords out of their hands and do crazy stuff that it completely feels at odds with some of the earlier games in the series. Yeah. But yes, I would say that him kind of being off the leash and being able to do what he wants to do and kind of define the parameters of all of these new worlds and games is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, because you've been playing Death Stranding as well, and would you say that there's a notable difference in the way that Kojima took on the game and the project as a whole, or is there a lot of similarities to be found? What can you say about it?
I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, and I think that there definitely are quite a lot of differences. I'd say that, like, the biggest similarity is that its story is pretty exhaustive and incredibly detailed. There is an incredible amount of lore and thought that has got into it. Again, not saying all of this lore and thought is perfect. I'm just saying it is very much in the same style as what he did previously with Metal Gear Solid. I'd say that where it's most different from Metal Gear Solid, though, is that gameplay-wise, the Metal Gear Solid games very much cast you as this sort of like super soldier who is very experienced and is like physically, like generally playing as Snake or Raiden or whatnot feels good. You feel like somebody who can basically cause the ground to tremble under your feet and is capable of getting out of the most impossible of situations. Sam Bridges in Death Stranding is not that kind of an individual. He's, a well-built, good-looking man, but he is definitely at the mercy of the elements, at the mercy of his environments 99% of the time. And like, whereas in a game like Metal Gear Rising Revengeance or Metal Gear Solid 5, where in those games, when you're running along any road, be it up a hill, down an incline, just through a desert, in the snow, you basically are not at all mindful of the environment around you. You're only mindful of the enemies that you might face. In Death Stranding, like, you are incredibly mindful on a minute-to-minute basis of every single rock, every single slope, every single incline, every single possible environmental factor that might affect you. It's a lot more... Like, not to say that the previous Metal Gear Solid games weren't mindful, but this game is like mindful on a whole nother level.
Okay, interesting. So in the end, what are your thoughts on the future of the Metal Gear Solid franchise as it currently stands? Is there any reason for fans to be optimistic about where it might go next, or did the series' final outing serve as an omen for future Metal Gear, the future of the franchise, so to speak?
When Konami, gave Kojima the boot back in 2015, I think a lot of people assumed that, well, not only is this the end of Metal Gear Solid, but this is also the end of Konami making video games in general. Sorry, not video games in general, but like specifically, console games in general. There was a kind of quote that was circulated about how Konami was going to be positioning itself to be a mobile-first company, and people assumed, well, I guess all we have to look forward to now are gacha games and pachinko machines. And yet, over the past couple of years, Konami has made a surprising number of, traditional console games, and some of them have been not that bad. There's been like Super Bomberman R for the Nintendo Switch. There's been a Zone of the Enders HD collection that came out not too long ago. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was Metal Gear Survive, which was not that great, but also like not terrible either. It helped in Metal Gear Solid Survive's case that game was built like 99% off of the foundation that was built off of Metal Gear Solid 5, which obviously, as we previously discussed, was a really good game. So it definitely benefited from that. So like, I would have said a couple of years ago, there's no way the Metal Gear Solid series continues. Now, I'm honestly not that sure. I think it does have a very good shot at continuing. But as I said earlier in this conversation, I think that if it wants to continue and it wants to be good, Konami needs to find another kind of Kojima-like figure and start kind of grooming them for the role. They need to start kind of getting them ready to eventually take over it. This is a little bit of a quick last-minute tangent. Are you familiar with the game Undertale?
Yeah, I've played 10 minutes of it.
Okay, so Undertale is this role-playing game that was released by Toby Fox back in 2015. And basically, when it came out, a lot of people noted that it felt very similar in tone to the Earthbound series from Nintendo, which are a series of kind of quirky RPGs that explore, I'd say, like a lot of similar thematic content, have a lot of similar quirky characters, so on and so forth. Over the past couple of years, Toby Fox has gotten increasingly more and more involved in a couple of Nintendo projects here and there. Sans, who's like a main character from Undertale, appeared as like a costume in Super Smash Bros. He composed some music for a couple of Game Freak games, including the most recent Pokemon games, Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield. And somebody online noted like, is Nintendo grooming this guy to eventually make another Earthbound game, considering that he already made a really good Earthbound game in Undertale? And it's like, I feel like something similar needs to happen with Metal Gear Solid 5. They need to find somebody who already makes Kojima-esque games and basically be like, hey, we want to groom you into being the next Kojima, and then kind of hand over the license to him. I think that's probably the best case scenario for what happens next. But I don't know who that could be. One name that kind of... Sorry?
Might I suggest a name?
Sure.
Yoko Taro?
That literally was the person who I was about to bring up.
Okay, well, great, we're on the same page then.
Yeah. So who knows? But I also think Yoko Taro likes his position at Square Enix quite a fair bit. So we'll see what happens there. Okay, well, that wraps up our discussion about Metal Gear. We hope you've enjoyed, hearing Alexander talk about the franchise that's so dear to him. You can check us out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/gamers. Our personal Twitter profiles. Mine is the Ailert. Yep, and mine is at Alex Kozina. And be sure to check us out on Patreon as well. It's patreon.com/gamers. We hope you have a nice day, and we'll see you in the next episode. See ya. Goodbye. Bye.